Welcome back to NestJs full course. Today's episode tackles all things about validation in NestJs. We'll explore transform pipes, then we're going to use DTOs with class validator to enforce validation in request bodies, and then we're going to enforce validation in route parameters and search queries. We also write our custom validation transform pipes and even dive into Zod, which is a new option for powerful validation in NestJs. Also, we're going to show you how we can apply validation API level, module level, and also global level. So welcome to Sakura Dev channel, and without further ado, let's get into it. So I open up our NestJs project here. We're in the property controller, and here as you can see we have a get endpoint with an ID param. So as you can see here, we just extract the ID from the URL and just return it to the client. If I log the type of the ID, and if I go to Insomnia and here send a get request to the /property and then /24, for example, hit the send here, you can see we have the 24. But if I go back to our terminal, you can see here the type of the ID is string. So how we can turn the type of the ID to number? Of course, a naive way here is to just use the number class and pass the ID to it. And if I get back to Insomnia, hit the send, get back to our terminal, you can see the type is now number. But this is not the way that we are going to practice here. We are going to transform the type of the ID automatically. So here, just remove this number class, and here we can use something called pipes for transforming the ID type automatically. For now, let's try the parse int pipe. And now if I save that, get back to Insomnia, hit the send here, back to our terminal, you can see the type is now number. Okay, so with the parse int pipe, we can automatically transform value of a param or a query automatically to int. And note that we have other pipe. For example, we can have parse bool type. So let me give an example here. So let's say that we have a search query here. Let's go to the Insomnia. Here after the param in our URL, we have a search query, for example, sort, which is going to be a boolean. In this case, it has the value of true. So we can transform the type of the sort in our get request automatically to boolean type. Let's get back to VS Code, and here in order to access to the search query, we can use a decorator called query, and then here, just like the param, we need to specify the name of our query. In this case, it is going to be sort. And note that unlike the param here, we don't need to specify the name of the query inside our get decorator. So after the query, we can have a parameter for the search query, and here we can use our transform pipe, which is going to be in this case parse bool pipe. As you can see, we have other pipes for transforming the data. We have the bool type, array pipe, file pipe, and float pipe. And in this case, since the sort is a boolean, we're going to use the parse bool type. And now if I console log the sort type, we should get its type as boolean. Back to Insomnia, let's send the request. Get back to our VS Code and open up the terminal. You can see the first one is number, which is for ID param, and the second one is boolean, which is for our search query. So in this way, we can automatically transform the type of incoming param and also search queries in our NestJs controllers. So note that here we use query for accessing the search queries in our URL. In this section, we are going to use validation pipes for validating the body of incoming request. So in this section, we're going to use the traditional way of validating the body of a request with class validator and class transformers. And in the next section in this video, we are going to use the Zod package for validating the body of our incoming request. So the Zod actually is a kind of new way of validating the body of incoming request in NestJs. So as I said, we're going to use that in the next section, but in this section, we are going to use the class transformers and class validator. So in the first step here, we need to create a type for the body of our incoming request, and then we're going to use the class transformers and class validator to validate the body based on the type that we have defined. So in our module, property module, we're going to create a new directory. I'm going to call it DTO, and inside this DTO directory, we're going to create a create property.dto.ts, and inside this file, we're going to export a class here, export class create property DTO, and in this class we are going to define the fields that we need inside the body of the incoming request. As the name implies, this is going to be for creating a new property. So it is going to have a name inside it, which is going to be string, and a description, which is going to be string as well, an area, which is going to be number. Okay, so we need these three fields inside the body of our request. So get back to our controller, and here we can set the type of the body to our create property DTO class. Now if I go to Insomnia, and here on the property, let's send a post request, and let's set the body of our request to something that has name and type inside it, which is inconsistent to the create DTO that we have just defined. So if I send the request, you can see without any error, we get the body inside our response, and our API doesn't complain about it, and actually there is no validation in this API. So in order to enforce the validation on this endpoint, we need to use the class validator and class transformers library. So get back to VS Code, open up the terminal, and install these two libraries, which are class validator and class transformer. Okay, now let's close the terminal, and I go to my DTO, create property DTO, and here we can use decorators that come from the class validator to enforce the validation for this DTO. So here we can use @isString for the first field, which says that this field is going to be a string. And also let's copy that for the second field description, and for the third field, which is going to be a number, we use isInt decorator. Okay, now if I go back to Insomnia and hit the send request, still we don't have any validation applied. So we need to do something more in our controller. Get back to VS Code, and I go back to our controller, and here in the body section, we need to explicitly that we want to use the validation on this API. So here in our post request, we can use another decorator, which is usePipe, and inside the usePipes, we are going to create an instance of the validation pipe, which comes from the NestJs/common, and let's save this, and now the validation is applied on the body of this post request. Get back to Insomnia, send the request. We can see we have a bad request here, and we have a message here that says description must be a string, and also area must be an integer. So if I add the description here in the body, description, and set it to a string here, and again we need to add the area and set it to a number, hit the send request, you can see now we have the response without any error. But here's the problem here. We have the type inside the body of the request, but we don't define that inside our create property DTO. So in order to remove the extra field that we don't need them inside the body, you can use an option in our validation pipe. Get back to the VS Code, and here inside the validation pipe, we can set the whitelist to true. This will actually remove the extra properties that does not exist inside our create property DTO. Get back to Insomnia, and this time if I send the request, you can see the type is automatically removed from the body of the request. And if we want to enforce more strict validation, for example, we want to send back an error to the client if we have an extra field inside our DTO, we can use another option in our validation pipe. Get back to the VS Code. Here we can use forbid non-vital list and set it to true. Now if I get back to Insomnia and hit the send request, you can see now this time we have an error here, and it says that the property type should not exist. So if I remove the type here and also remove the comma after last field and send the request, you can see now we don't have any error. So with the whitelist, we just automatically remove the extra fields from our body, and with the forbid non-vital list, we send back an error to the client if there isn't any extra field inside the body of our request. back to VS Code, we have another way to apply the validation pipe for a specific endpoint. Instead of use pipes here, we can just use the validation pipe inside the body decorator. I just copy the validation pipe here and paste it inside the body request. And then I just comment out the use pipe here. If I go back to the Insomnia, let's put back the type to the body of the request. And if I send the request, you can see we have the validation here, which says that the property type should not exist. So if I remove the type here, and this time you can see we don't have any error. So it's up to you to use pipes or just directly use the validation pipe inside the body of the request for applying the validation on a specific endpoint. And for the last step in this section, let's get back to the create DTO. Here we can use lots of decorator for data validation in our DTO. For example, if I open up the autocomplete, you can see lots of these decorators for validation, and you can use them in your validation. For example, let's use length here for the name, and here we need to pass the mean length to 2 and max length to, for example, 10. And then if I go back to Insomnia, here if I add some character to the name and hit the send request, you can see we have a message here that says there must be shorter than 10 characters. Now if I just put one character, you can see it says that the name must be longer than or equal to 2 characters. We can also have custom messages for our validation. Get back to DTO here. In each of these decorator, we can pass an object, and inside the object, we can put our custom message. For example, we can say error on length. Although the default messages are really good, and in most cases, we don't need to use custom messages. So just to test it, let's go back to Insomnia, and if I send the request, you can see we have the custom error message. Now let's get back to VS Code and do something more on the area, which is a number. We can use, for example, is positive, and then inside the Insomnia, if I put a negative number here, send request, you can see we have the message area must be a positive number. Even if we pass 0, we still have the same error. Okay, so far we have seen how we can use this decorator for enforcing the validation on the body of the incoming request. Sometimes we want to enforce some of the validation for creating a property, and sometimes we want to enforce some other validation for updating a property. Of course, we can create another DTO for updating the property, but here we can do that with just one DTO and use the group option in our class validator decorator. So for example, here in the description, let's say on the update, we want to have a length here, and this is going to be between 2 and 10, and we want to enforce this validation only when we are creating a new property. So here we can pass an option object, and inside the option specify the groups, and here inside the list, for example, we can say create, and then we can have another length decorator. This time we're going to use 1 as the mean length, and for example 15 as the max length, and we want to apply that only when we are updating a property. Of course, these lengths are just dummy length, and just for example, it doesn't make sense in the real world application, but here I'm going to just show you how we can use groups in our validation system. So now let's get back to the controller. We have already the create function inside the option object of the validation pipe. We can specify the groups here and specify the create here for this one, and then I'm going to create another request for updating the property. This time I'm going to use patch request. Of course, we need to have a params here, which is going to be ID, and then we're going to have update function, and inside it we're going to have the body. Inside the body we need to specify the validation pipe, and here let's just copy the configuration object of this validation pipe and paste it here, and this time the groups is going to be update. Then we're going to have the body parameter, which its type is going to be create property DTO. As you can see, we didn't create a new DTO for updating. We're just using the same DTO that we have used for create function. So that's why we use the groups here. Inside the function, we just return the body object. Okay, and now let's get back to the Insomnia. Let's put a name for the property, and here in the description, let's have a description with length just 1, which actually violates the validation. If I get back to the DTO, you can see on create the minimum length is 2, but on update the minimum length is 1. So just get back to Insomnia and hit the send request. You can see this route is mapped to the create function. So if I hit the request, you can see that it complains about the name, which says that the name should not exist, area should not exist, but here in the description it says that it must be longer than 2 characters. So group validation works for the description, but it also complains about name and area. And that's because when we are using the groups in our DTO, we need to specify the properties that are not inside any group, like name and area. If I get back to the DTO here, we only use the groups on the description field. So here inside the name field and in the isString, we're going to pass an option object, and here inside it we're going to set the always to true. In this way, we are telling the DTO that it must always validate the name in our validation system. It doesn't matter if we are on the create group or update group. So we just copy this object here and paste it in the area field and save that, get back to Insomnia and hit the send request. You can see the errors on the name and area are gone, and we have the error on the description, and that's because this route is mapped to the create function and the length of the property is just 1. So if I put a string with the length 2, you can see now we don't have any error. But if I go to the update property, which is on the property /id, and change the method to patch, you can see we don't have any error. And here if I change the length of the description to 1, you can see still we don't have any error, because in the update group we've set the minimum length to 1. So in this way we can use the groups within our DTO. But here, as you can see, putting always true on all the fields that are common on all the groups is a tedious work. So we can just remove them here from the field that belongs to all the groups and just go to our controller, and here on our validation pipe we can just set the always to true here, and that will do the work for us. Get back to Insomnia, you can see we're on the update path, and if I hit the send request, you can see we don't have any error on name and area. So in this way you can use groups in your DTO for validation across multiple endpoints. In this section, we are going to apply global validation. So we don't need to use validation pipe on each endpoint that we want to put validation on. Let's go to the main.ts file, and here we can use app.use global pipes, and inside this function we're going to pass an instance of the validation pipe. So I'm going to say new validation pipe, and here inside it we can pass the options. We're going to pass the whitelist to true and also forbid known whited list to true. Okay, so now we don't need to set the validation pipe on our endpoint. So I just remove the validation here, okay, and also in the update function remove the validation. I go to Insomnia, and here on the update path, if I send the request, you can see it complains about the description, that it should be longer than or equal to 2 characters. It means that the groups doesn't work on global validation. So if I go to the create DTO here, you can see the first length decorator, in which we have set the mean length to 2, is applied even if the group is create. So as I said, actually these groups doesn't work, just the first one will be applied. So again, just to use the global validation, go to main.ts file and call the use global pipes and pass the new validation instance, and inside that pass your options. Now it actually enforced the validation across all your application, including all modules, but you can use global validation on any specific module. So we can just remove that, and for example, let's say we want to use global validation only on the property module. So inside the property module, we can set the providers list, and inside this list we can pass an object here, And inside the object, first we need to set the provide property to app pipe, which comes from the NestJs/core. And then here, if we don't want to use any option, we can set the use class to validation pipe. Okay, so it actually applied the global validation on the property module without any option. If we want to pass the options, instead of use class, use value, and then you can pass an instance of the validation pipe. So you can pass an option object to it, and here you can set the whitelist to true and also forbid non-whitelisted to true. Okay, so if I get back to Insomnia, if I send the request, you can see still validation is working. So in this way, you can apply global validation for any specific module. In this section, we are going to put the validation on the ID params. So in the first section of this video, we have applied the parseInt pipe, which only turned the type of the ID to number. But in this section, we are going to put some validation rules on the ID params. For example, it should be a number and a positive number. So we can do that in two ways. We can write a custom transform pipe just like the parseInt pipe, or we can just use a DTO and put the validation with class validator inside that DTO for the ID. So inside the DTO directory, I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call it ID param.dto.ts, and inside we're going to export a class. I'm going to name it ID param DTO. Inside it, we're going to have an ID, which is going to be number, and we can use the class validator here. It is going to be an int, okay, and then we can apply is positive. And then I go back to the controller in the update function, which is a patch endpoint. We have the ID here, so just remove the validation here because we are actually using the global validation pipes. And then here we have the param, so just use the param decorator. Here we shouldn't specify the name of the param, we just need to access the whole param object, and it is going to be param and its type is going to be ID param DTO. Okay, now if I go back to the Insomnia and let's put some character to remove the error on the description. So you can see here the description error is gone, but here it says that the ID must be a positive number and also must be an integer number. But here we have passed the 24, which is a number. So actually, as I said, the ID here in our URL is a string, not a number. So in order to fix that, in the first section, you have seen that we use parseInt pipe, but here we can do something better. I go to the property module, and here in the global pipe, we can just set the transform to true. And then we need to set the transform option. Inside the object, we need to enable implicit conversion to true. Okay, so if I save that, get back to Insomnia and hit the send request, you can see that now we don't have any error. But here, if I do something gibberish, you can see we have an error on the ID. And also if I put a negative number, we have an error that said ID must be a positive number. Or if I put 0, we still have the same error. So in this way, we can have validation on our params. Also, you can do the same for your search queries. Just remember that you shouldn't specify the name of your params inside your param decorator. And also you can just extract the ID from the ID param DTO and work directly with your ID. And still you have your validation ID on work. So this is the first way of validating the ID param. We can do that in another way, and that's it by creating a custom transform pipe. So in this section, we are going to validate the ID param by creating a custom transform pipe. So here inside our property module, we're going to create a new directory. I'm going to call it pipes. And inside it, we're going to create a file called parseID pipe.ts. Inside it, we're going to export a class. I'm going to name it parseID pipe, and it should implement the pipe transform. And here we need to set two generics. The first one is going to be the source type, which is string. So as you know, the default type of our params are string, and then the output type is going to be a number. So here in this pipe, we are actually transforming the ID from string to number, and also we want to validate the ID. So here inside our class, we need to implement the transform function, which as you can see, the value is string, which is the value of the param that we extract from the URL, and then it should have a metadata. We don't want to do anything with this argument, and as you can see, it should return a number. So inside this transform, first we need to transform the value to number and then validate it based on our validation rule. First, I'm going to call the parseInt function to transform the value to a number, and in the second argument we need to pass the radix, which is going to be 10, and then we need to keep the returning value to a constant called val. Now we can check if value is none. So I use the isNone function. We can throw a new bad request exception with a custom message. For example, we're going to say ID must be a number, okay? And then we can apply another validation. For example, we can say if val is less than or equal to 0, again, we can throw a new bad request exception, this time with another custom message. We're going to say ID must be positive, okay? And then we just need to return the val. So in this pipe, first we turn this value, which is a string, to a number, and then we check if the value is a none. We throw the bad request exception with the custom message. Then we check if the value is less than or equal to 0. We send another bad request exception. So these are two validation rules for our pipe. Now let's save this, and I go to the controller. Here, instead of this validation way, which we have used with the DTO, I need to specify the ID, the name of the param, which is ID, and then we can specify the transform pipe, which is going to be parse ID pipe, and then we're going to have the ID here. So let's save that, and let's go to Insomnia. Here, let's send the request. You can see we have a badge request which says that ID must be positive. If I put something positive, you can see we don't have any error. If we do some string, you can see that the ID must be a number, even a negative number, ID must be positive. So in this way, we can write a custom transform pipe for validating the ID params. Also, keep in mind that if you want to use this pipe outside of this module, you need to mark it with injectable decorator. Otherwise, you can't use it outside of this module. We're going to talk about the dependency injection in the upcoming section of this course. So for now, just know that if you want to use this pipe outside of this module, other modules, you need to mark it with the injectable decorator. Okay, so now we can go to the next section. In this section, we are going to apply the Zod package for validation in our NestJs application. Validation with Zod is kind of new in NestJs. So the class validator is the traditional way for enforcing the validation, but you can choose to use Zod for validation in your NestJs application. It's up to you to choose between these two options. So in order to use Zod in our application, first we need to install the Zod package. So I open up the terminal and just install the Zod npm I Zod. Okay, let's close the terminal, and I go to the create property DTO. I just create another DTO. I'm going to say create property zod.dto.ts. Inside this file, instead of exporting a class, we need to export a schema. So I'm going to say export const create property schema, and then use the Zod package. So I import the Z from Zod, and then I'm going to say z.object, and inside this object we're going to have name, which is going to be string. So I'm going to set it to z.string. We're going to have the description, which is going to be z.string again, and we're going to have the area, which is going to be z.number. Okay, we can also chain another function. For example, for the area, we can chain the positive, which means that this is going to be a positive number. And also with the description, we can pass, for example, mean or max, which is going to be, for example, 5 for the description. And we can also pass the custom messages. We're going to pass an object, and we can set the message here just like this. But most of the time, we're going to go ahead with the default error messages. And lastly, we're going to call the required on the whole object. Okay, now we can infer our DTO from our create property schema. So here I'm going to say export type create property DTO, or let's just put a Zod here in order to distinguish between the previous DTO, create property Zod DTO, and set it to z.infer and pass the type of create property schema. Okay, so just rename the create property schema and change the C first letter to a lowercase. Okay, now we need to create a Zod validation pipe. So inside the pipe directory, I'm going to create a new file, Zod Validation pipe.ts file, and inside it we're going to export a class. we'll name it Zod Validation pipe. It's a custom validation pipe that should implement the pipe transform. Inside it, we're going to call the constructor, and inside the constructor, we're going to have the schema. So private schema, and its type is going to be a Zod schema. Okay, now we're going to put the curly braces for the body of the constructor. We don't want to add anything inside the body of the constructor. Here we need to implement the transform function. Inside it, we're going to use the try catch block. Inside the try block, we're going to parse the value with the Zod. So I'm going to say const parsed value and use that schema that parse and pass the value. Okay, so this dot schema comes from the constructor. It's actually using the dependency injection, and of course we're going to talk about the dependency injection in depth in upcoming section of this course. And then here from the try catch, we can just return the parsed value. So if some validation rule that we have defined on this Zod schema failed, it's actually thrown error. So we can catch the error and actually throw a new badge request exception with a message inside it, validation failed. So now let's save this, and if we are going to use Zod validation pipe, we need to turn off the global validation. So I just go to the property module and just comment this section, which is for using the global validation pipes, and I go to the property controller, and here in the create function we're going to use pipes here. So I'm going to use pipes decorator, and inside the use pipe, just like before, we're going to pass a new instance of validation pipe, but this one is going to be Zod validation pipe, the custom validation pipe that we have just created in this file, and then pass the schema, which is going to be create property schema that we have created in the create property Zod DTO here. Okay, get back to the controller, and also we need to set the type of the body to create property Zod DTO. Now let's get back to Insomnia. If I send the request, you can see we don't have any error, but if I put a string instead of number for the area, hit the send request, you can see we have a message validation failed. But here, as you can see, we don't have any specific error messages for the area. In order to fix that, let's get back to our Zod validation pipe. So here I go to the Zod validation pipe, and here instead of this try catch block, I'm going to just remove that. Actually, this method is on the NestJs documentation, but here I'm going to do it in another way, and in which we can have the specific error messages for our validation. So let's remove the try catch block here, and instead of the parse, we need to use the save parse. Okay, so this is the first section, and here we're going to check if parsed value that success, we're going to just return the parse value. Otherwise, we can just throw a new error, and instead of this general message validation failed, we can return parsed value that error that format. Now if I save that and get back to Insomnia, send the request again, you can see now we have a specific error that says an area we have expected number but received a string. So if I change it back to a number, you can see we don't have any error. You can see we have a object that has data inside it. So in order to fix that, we're going to get back to Zod validation pipe, and here we're going to return parsed value dot data. Get back to Insomnia, send the request, you can see now we have the body. Okay, if I put 0, we have another error on the area which says that number must be greater than 0. So yeah, that's it for validating with Zod package in our NestJs application. So let me do a recap here. First, we need to create a Zod validation pipe that implements the pipe transform. In constructor, we're going to have schema, which its type is going to be Zod schema, and then we're going to implement the transform, and inside the transform we're going to use the schema that save parse and parse the incoming value. We check if the parse operation was success. We're going to just return the parse data. Otherwise, we can just throw a bad request exception with the parse value error format. So this expression actually returns specific errors in our bad request exception for our validation. And then we need to create a schema for our validation with Zod, and then infer the DTO with z.infer and pass the type of our create property schema. So these 3 steps you should take in order to implement the Zod validation with your NestJs application. So yeah, that's it for validation section of our NestJs full course. And if you have any suggestion for upcoming section, you can share it with me in the comment section below. You can access to the next video through this link here, and also you can access to the full playlist through this link. And if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button button. It gives me more energy to move forward and create such a free tutorials for you. And please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification so you don't miss the next episode. Have a nice time. Stay tuned for my next video. Bye bye.